Faith stems from an open heart. I don't know if you've picked it up, if you've been here the last couple of weeks as we've been going through the story of Moses, but you'll hear these little words that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And so today we're going to kind of explore that a bit because I think that faith has a tremendous ability to transform not just ourselves and our stories and our lives, but to transform our families and to transform our communities and to transform those around us. But it starts with an open heart. Because it's very easy to close up our hearts to think, hey, it's not possible. We come up with excuses. God doesn't this, or doesn't exist, or he's not a part of my life, or he's not looking after me, or he's looking after other people, or I'm too busy. And we come up with all kinds of excuses as to why we should avoid faith or not touch base with faith or even have faith in our life. But yet for many of us, it is the cornerstone of our existence. It's the reason why we exist. It's the reason why we find meaning, purpose, life, and hope in life. And so if you'd like to join me this morning, we're going to dive right in. We're going to read from Exodus. And this is the classic example. We're going to pick it up a little bit later off of where Dale left off last week. But we're going to pick it up in Exodus chapter 14 and verses 5 to 31. And those of you that know the Moses story, this is a very familiar passage. But I want to pick up a couple themes out of here this morning for us. In chapter 14, verses 5 and following, if you got an NIV Bible, you can follow along or on the screens. It says this. Then the Lord, verse 5, when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officers changed their minds about them and said, what have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services. In case you weren't here in the last couple of weeks, Moses was called by God in the desert at the age of 80 years to go back to Egypt, back to his hometown where he grew up, and to tell Pharaoh to let my people go. And he goes with the message, and there's all the plagues and all the stuff that goes on. And finally, Pharaoh lets God's people go. So he's let them go, and all of a sudden, guess what? He's having second thoughts. So he and his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 of his best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi-Hahiroth opposite Baal-Zephon. These are a bunch of slaves. They are no match for any army, yet the Egyptian army at the height of its power. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there was no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would be better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. Now remember, these are the same people that have just seen the 10 plagues of Egypt. They've seen frogs, they've seen pestilence, they've seen darkness, they've seen blackness. They've seen God deliver their firstborn sons by the blood that was painted on the doorposts. And all of Pharaoh's and the other kingdoms when the Egyptian sons died. They've seen it all. And as soon as there's just a little bit of opposition or a little bit of trouble, they go back to blaming Moses and blaming God. We should have just stayed there. You should have just left us alone. Didn't we tell you this was going to happen? That's a classic example of not having faith. And if you read through the rest of the story, there's this constant bouncing back and forth of God's people and their struggle with trust and faith in God. It's so real. Verse 13, Moses answered the people, do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. These Egyptians you see you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You only need to be still. Then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? I love that line. God's like, what are you talking? Like, why are you crying out to me? Wasn't that what we're supposed to do? Like, we're supposed to go to God first, right? So that's what Moses is doing. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide it through the water so the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. Yeah, like that's what I would have thought standing at the corner of the Red Sea. Like, raise my staff and see what happens. Anyways, I love this. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so they will go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all of his army, through his chariots and horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord, and then I will gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. And the angel of the Lord, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of the cloud also moved from and in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to the one side and light to the other side, so neither went near the other side all night long. This is the stuff of movies. The Egyptians pursued them. Verse 21. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and that night the Lord drove back the sea with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided. The Israelites went through on the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw them into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving, and the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them and against Egypt." Ding, 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 they start to see the light. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and the horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to the place. The Egyptians were fleeing towards it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and the horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. How do I have an open heart? How do I have the type of faith that when I am facing circumstances or opposition in life and the armies of life, when I'm facing somebody who has a hardened heart, how do I have the faith to stand firm and to keep my heart open to God's movement and to God's direction in my heart and in my life? Well, I think there's a couple of things here that just jump out of me, out of this text as I read through this, that reflect on Pharaoh and this whole story, that can help you and me today as we ask ourselves that question. And the first one is, we die to ourselves. You know, one of the things that Pharaoh had, when it says here, when he decides, oh, I got a problem, I'm going to go after them, is what? It's we're not going to have our servants anymore. A possession, a thing, power over somebody else. And we as human beings like that. We like authority. We like to be able to tell people what to do. We like it when people obey us and do what we tell them. We love it when people come to us for advice. It gives us a sense of belonging. It gives us a sense of identity. It gives us a sense of, oh, I'm actually important. I actually have some significance here. But it's interesting that as you read through the Gospels, as you follow through the Bible, and all the different stories that pop up here and time after again, you'll notice a very prominent theme. That people who have an open heart, people who are people of faith, are willing to die to themselves. They're willing to give up whatever God asks them, to go wherever God calls them to go, to do whatever God is asking them to do. They are willing to die to themselves. Exactly the opposite of what Pharaoh was doing. All he was concerned about was himself. The only reason why he let the Israelites go in the first place was out of total remorse because of all the death that had happened with the death and the destruction of the firstborn in Egypt. He finally recognized, oh, I can't win against this God. And so out of remorse, he finds, okay, just get lost. Just go. Just beat it. Go do what you're supposed to do. Only to regret it afterwards because he still hadn't gotten the point. That the point was that God was on the throne, that God was in control, and our responsibility, our calling as human beings, when we're confronted with God, when we're confronted with his moving and with his power, we are to die to ourselves and let God be God. This worked in both camps. For the Egyptians, because they lost their workforce and they were angry, upset, and they were bent on destruction. The Hebrews lost faith in the face of a serious threat. They weren't willing to die to themselves either. They were like, hey, let me just go back to Egypt. Let me just get out of here. Rather than trusting in God and dying to themselves. It's not always easy. Selfishness is very blinding. Our society is consumed by it. Our lives are consumed by it. It's all about me, about what I want and what I need and what I think I need. I think I've used this illustration before, but I think it's a great one. As Oklahoma was settled, the growing population supported a small community of lawyers. One lawyer had become quite successful handling disputes between ranchers and farmers. He sent his son away for college and was pleased when his son returned after graduation, seeking to work in his office and to figure out if he wanted to become a lawyer, even though he had just done all the studies. The lawyer welcomed his son to the firm and gave him a job as a clerk. On his son's first day, the first client called the lawyer was a man, deeply tanned from years of toil under the Oklahoma sun. His hands were rough and calloused, and he was dressed for the range. The man explained, I'm a ranch hand at the Smith Ranch, where I have worked since I was very young. For all those years, I have tended to all the animals on the ranch, including a small herd of cows. I raised the cows, fed them, and cared for them. It has always been my understanding that I was the owner of these cows. Mr. Smith died, and his sons inherited the ranch. He believes, the son inherited the ranch, that the cows were raised on the family's land and then were fed by the family's hay, and that therefore they are his cows. I need you to help me. The lawyer smiled and put his hand on the man's shoulders. I've heard enough, and I will take your case. Don't worry about the cows. After expressing extreme gratitude, the workman left the lawyer's office. A short time later, the next client arrived. He was a young, well-groomed, and appeared quite wealthy young man. He explained to the lawyer, my name is Smith, and I own a ranch near here I inherited from my father. For many years, one of my ranch hands has taken care of his family's herds, including some cows. The cows were raised on my land, fed by my hay. They were obviously my cows or my father's cows. Yet he believes that as he raised them and cared for them, they're his. I would like you to resolve the matter of the ownership of the cows. The lawyer smiled and said, I've heard enough, and I will take your case. Don't worry about the cows. After the man left the office, the lawyer's son came to his father looking puzzled. He said, I don't understand. He said, I may not know much about the law, but it seems to me that there's a serious problem with the cows, and you just told both sides not to worry. The lawyer replied, yeah, I told them not to worry about the cows, son, because pretty soon they're all going to be ours. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Philippians chapter 2, verse 3. Rather, in humility, consider others, value others above yourself. James 3:16, for where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you will find disorder and every evil practice. In order to keep our heart open, we need to die to ourselves. It's so difficult no matter what stage of life you're in, no matter whether you've been a Christian all of your life, this thing to dying to ourselves, to putting others first, to not letting our heart get hardened to the things of the world or the things that are around us or to the people around us is so difficult because we are so inherently selfish. It's easy to look at Pharaoh and go, what a nutcase. How did he even think he was going to get away with that after everything that he had seen? It's because he was selfish. And selfishness has a way of blinding us to the realities around us. So if you want an open heart, die to yourself. If you want an open heart, be open to God's involvement. The Israelites, and I get it because, I do the same thing. But you would think that after all that they had seen, a cloud is going before them and has led them to the Red Sea. You would think that they would get the idea that God is for them, that God is looking after them, and that everything's going to be okay, that God will be involved. And yet the moment there's a bit of turmoil, the moment the Egyptian army comes to pursue them, they panic. Because really at this point in Israel's history, as they're coming out as slaves, they're not really open to God's involvement yet. They've seen things. They've seen incredible things. But they're still closed off. They still themselves have got a hardened heart because they cannot see past themselves. They cannot see past the sea that's right in front of them. They're consumed with survival, consumed with all about themselves, not trusting, as we'll see in a minute, or being open to God's involvement in their life. They have a cloud in front of them to protect them. They got a cloud in front of them that separates them from the army. It's just an absolutely incredible, miraculous story. You know, sometimes it's so easy in our worlds to have such a small view of God and the possibilities. Now, that's sometimes a little bit easier for me. I'm a risk taker. And many of you would say, I'm not really a risk taker. Those of you that know, for the last 2 weeks, I bought an old 1999 RV, and I decided, let's drive 9,000 kilometers down to Tucson and Grand Canyon and cover Las Vegas and do a whole grand tour. And most people would never do that because all the things that could happen when you drive an RV that's 26 years old, and believe me, they did happen. So I'm a bit of a risk taker. I do crazy things. I like to have fun, but sometimes it's also because I think that God gives me ideas and gives me blessing and just allows me to do some crazy things that it's just, if you take the risk away, you go. We've lived in Israel for a couple of years. We've traveled. We've done some incredible things. And without a shadow of a doubt, God has always been there. Even when I'm doing things that are, for many people, they're just crazy and absurd and nuts. And sometimes like, yeah, this is crazy, absurd, and nuts. I knew when we left, we started driving. And for those of you that know a little bit of mechanics, you know when you start a car, there's a starter in a car, and that's the thing that kicks it into gear, turns it over, and starts your car. And so the problem when you got a big diesel engine is it takes a lot of energy, and that starter takes a lot of cranking power, and they tend to wear out. And had I had half a brain, I thought, my last RV we had years ago, we did another trip with our family, another crazy thing, an old beater, and we drove out, and day 2, the starter goes. And so this time I said, I'm hearing that, it's not so strong, but whatever, we'll go, and it'll, God will look after us, and one way or the other it'll happen. So, we're driving down, and we drove through some idiotic weather all the way down. It was not as bad as coming home, but we drove all the way down, and at any point, that starter could have stopped working. Our first stop was Las Vegas. So we did a whole bunch of things. We were staying in an RV park. We had lots of fun. We spent an evening and a day there, and went in and out. And the contrast between, the lights and the razzle dazzle of Las Vegas and the splendor of the Grand Canyon is like light and day, absolutely incredible. But anyways, we're there. We're having fun, and so we're supposed to go to the Grand Canyon. If you know anything about the Grand Canyon, it's about 3 hours from Las Vegas. And so I go to start it, and nothing. And so, you call somebody, and we get it all fixed up, and everything works fine. Great. But had that starter, started, and we got into the Grand Canyon in the middle of nowhere, the South Pacific Rim, we were hours from anything. It would have cost me way more money than it already cost, and it would have been a disaster. It would have been a mess. Now, maybe it's just coincidence. I don't think so. I think in all of my stupidity and all of and trying to enjoy life and be able to share that with my family and kids and those around me, that God is still there. And I'm open to God just meeting our needs and providing as He goes forth. The RV was a gift. We got an incredible price. I had said, as I was thinking about it and praying about it, I said, look, if I can get it for this price, because all the other ones that were looking too expensive, and God opened up the doors. So if God opens up the doors, I'll go and I'll try and do some crazy things. And God's always there. Maybe not according to my plans. I was supposed to be back home on Friday night. But on Friday night, as we're driving through so many storms, trying to get home and avoid everything, we're driving down the I-90 highway, and I had been watching the alternator on the RV start to do this all day long, and just get us home, Lord, just get us home, Lord, just get us home, Lord. And we're driving up the I-95. There's nothing for like 15, 20 hours, and we're driving through snow and blizzards, and we get to a place called Spokane, and we're driving down that main highway, and it went from to not working anymore, and we had about 5-10 minutes. The lights are dimming. We're pulling off, trying to find. We pull off this overpass. We get to this spot. We pull in a truck stop. We hadn't seen a truck stop for a day and a half. We pull into a truck stop, and it's done. We slept there that night. It was a nice truck stop, so the kids could be inside. It was warm. We came in and out. It was open 24 hours. The next morning, yesterday morning at 8 o'clock, I found there's a parts depot just down the road, a 20-minute walk. I'm not kidding, 20 minutes walk down. And so he has the starter in stock. So I walk down and I pick up the starter. He gives me the name of another guy who's close by. He shows up an hour and a half later, an old 66-year-old guy who's awesome. We had great conversations, lots of fun together. And by 2 o'clock, we were on the road again. Now, that could be a coincidence. But I know a lot of you were praying because my wife sent a little thing on Friday night saying, pray because the RV's, all there's not going. And we caught the 10 o'clock ferry last night. We were home by 2:30 by the skin of our teeth. So you can go, just coincidence, But when your heart is open, you see God's direct intervention in your life, even in the small things. And when you're traveling, those are huge things. But in the scheme of the world and what's going on, it's actually the very small thing. And to think that God and his angels, in everything that's going on in the world, does things like this in my life and in your life is pretty profound. Pretty profound. Die to yourself. Be open to God's involvement. Look for where he's moving. Look for what he's doing in your life, in the small things and in the big. And lastly, and this was going to be a story for the whole next number of chapters as Israel goes through the wilderness, is learn to trust in God. It took the Israelites 40 years and another whole generation to actually get it right, to put their trust in God. We don't have to wait 40 years. You can learn now to put your faith and to put your trust in God, because he will look after you. He will care for you as we die to ourselves, as we open up our hearts to his moving, to his life. Jacob Smith is a 15-year-old who's legally blind, but he's a free ride skier, they call it. Jacob has extreme tunnel vision and no depth perception on top of that. What he does see is very blurry. His visual acuity is rated at 20/800, which is like, very little. 4 times the level of legal blindness. Think of that big E on an eye chart when you go to do your eye checks. He needs to have it blown up 4 times before he can even begin to see that letter. So how does he ski? His family keeps him on course. On competition days, Jacob's little brother, Preston, patiently helps him hike to the top of the venue. It's so high the lifts won't take you there. Then his father, Nathan, helps him get him down. Jacob has a 2-way radio turned up high in his pocket. His dad is on the one end of the base and somehow calmly guides him down the mountain. Have you ever skied before? This is a whole other level of insanity. I think, some of you probably think I'm crazy taking a van, but like going down a hill and just trusting that the person in your headset's telling you, right? Like, talk about trust. Talk about trust. That's supposed to be our life in God. Many of you are going a black diamond. Life is just like flying you past. There's so many things happening, so many dangers, so many things that could blow up in your face, so many cliffs that you could jump off of, and you feel like that would be the end. And if you stop for a moment and just listen and put your trust in God, you'll hear that still small voice talking to you, comforting you, guiding you. The Israelites were so consumed, like, we got nowhere to go. There's the Egyptians. Like, they lost themselves in the circumstance. They lost themselves in the moment, despite what they had seen, despite what they had experienced. And I think that's encouraging for you and for me anyways, to know that somebody had seen so miraculous, amazing things. They lost it so quick. Sometimes we beat ourselves up a little bit. I should have had some more faith. I should have taken that opportunity. I should have spoken. I should have done something, and maybe we should have. And then we beat ourselves up or we panic. But the good news is that, first of all, that Jesus Christ is forgiving. And the second good news is that God continues to give us opportunities to put our faith and trust in him. It's not like just a test, Here's the one opportunity. Everything's built up to this. This is your moment where you are going to express your trust and your faith in God. And if you don't and you fail, that's it. It ends over. I'm walking away. That's not how it works. There might be consequences to the decisions that we make and the lack of faith that we have. But God is a God of love who loves to give us opportunities in circumstances and situations to learn to trust in him. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 6, 5 to 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Oh, I like my own understanding. Psalm 62, verse 8, trust in him at all times. Pour out your hearts to him, for God is our refuge. Faith stems from an open heart. I hope you find it difficult to identify with the Israelites or Pharaoh, both who are demonstrating a hardness of heart and a closing off of God's involvement and opportunity in their lives. So as you go from this week, let me ask you a couple questions. First of all, are you willing to die to yourself? When this selfishness comes up and you feel the prodding of God as you read your Bible, as you spend time praying, as you have a circumstance or situation where you seize an opportunity and you see somebody that you could talk to, pray for, lead to, whatever it is that God's telling you to do. But, oh, I'm busy, or I've got this going on, or I've got that, or I'm too diverse, or I don't have the skills, and we consume ourselves and we turn into the selfishness, which is so easy, or do we die to ourselves and seize the moment and have an open heart for God's moving? Are you open to God's movement and involvement in your life? To let him take the wheel, literally. You're driving in a snowstorm. There's sometimes in the last 3 days where I've said, Jesus, you take the wheel. You know, that stupid song, but it's like you're driving down. Where'd the highway go? I don't know. You just keep driving. God's there and he's involved. And are you willing to put your trust in God? Now that might mean you've never invited Jesus Christ into your life and you don't have a relationship with him, and this is where it starts, by putting your trust in him and seeking his forgiveness. Or it might be that God is asking you to do something or to live out your faith in different ways, in different perspectives, to share your faith, to take somebody out for coffee, to use the wealth or the generosity that God has given you to be generous to others. There's so many ways and so many things that God wants to do with your life if you're willing to put your trust in him. And that can be scary at times. It can be scary. But God will never let you down. When you're standing at the edge of a sea and there's an army coming to slaughter you and to take you back into slavery, God is there, and he always will be. Keep your heart open. Die to yourself. Be involved, open to God's movement, and put your trust in him. Let's pray. Jesus, we thank you for the amazing privilege that it is to have a relationship with you, to be able to read through the stories and the narratives that we find in the Bible that speak to us today, thousands of years later, in such practical ways. Maybe you're standing at the edge of a sea today in a meta sense, and there's huge opposition coming from family, from work, from wherever it is. And there's this sense that you're being overcome, this sense that you're going to be taken captive, this sense that you're going to fall apart, that your life is going to implode. But God is here for you. He loves you, and he's brought you to this place to demonstrate to you his power, his sovereignty, his love for you. All we need to do is die to ourselves and put our faith and trust in him. Whatever your circumstance in life is this week, as you go out into this world, die to yourself, put your faith in God, and allow him to move in profound ways so that the world may know that Jesus Christ is Lord. For these things we pray in your name, Jesus. Amen.